Yes, hello again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. As you can see, we're back here once again in CDB TV HQ after my recent vacation to the US of A. Oh, and by the way, I did meet one or two subscribers to my channel while I was over there. So hello to all of you over there in the US of A, and thanks again for taking the time to look at my video material. So right now we're going to continue with another classic dirt bike, and this is another one that I came across at the 2024 Telford show, and this is a bike that you don't see too often these days. So we're going to dive straight into that video now and take a look at this lovely 1981 KTM 125. Okay, so this immaculate KTM 125 Twinshocker was another of the rare bikes that I spotted at this year's Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. And although we did cover this machine briefly at the time here on CDB TV, we did say that we'd take a much closer look at this bike at a later date. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this episode. So this bike here and a few others were being displayed on the Solo Motorcycles stand at the show, and this bike here was being offered for sale at the time, and as I remember, it was quite a fair price for this bike, as I recall, and I do remember thinking at the time that this would have made a great starter bike for somebody who wanted to get into twin shock racing, but they didn't want something with too much power, just something that would be quite easy enough to handle and have a bit of fun on at the weekend. But the Solo Motorcycles website is definitely worth a look, because those guys specialise in buying and selling, restoring and even modifying old classic motorcycles, and they've certainly got a wide variety of machines in stock, including road bikes and other old classics like this nice KTM. But anyhow, have a quick look at their website and make your own mind up, and you can find them here at solomotorcycles.com. But certainly our featured bike here is a 1981 LC KTM 125, which is one of the later KTM twin shockers with the liquid-cooled engine, which they say very few of these type of models were actually made, and they reckon that this model here had a very short production life of just around 6 months. Now, when you take a look at the KTM brochure of 1981, it certainly listed this new LC 125 as the latest creation in modern motocross technology. And to be fair, it was quite a nice looking bike, although it still had those old twin shock rear suspension units and old school drum brakes on the front and at the rear. Although when you read through the specification sheet, it did have some quite impressive statistics, including magnesium engine casings, and it also had a 6-speed close ratio gearbox. At the front end, it had 38mm Marzocchi forks and of course Swedish Öhlins units at the back. And this liquid cooled version, I think, only weighed about 2 kilos more than the air cooled 125, which was also available as an option in 1981. So the word is that this bike here was run by Fari Oli Cosa in Bergamo in Italy, and the bike's rider at that time was Giuseppe Andriani, who won both races on this bike at the NSC Nieder-Wuschbach racetrack, which at that time was the home of the 1981 German motocross Grand Prix. So although the bike here is quite rare, it obviously has a good bit of history as well. Now, according to my quite dubiously sketchy research. This 1981 KTM 125 LC was part of the brand new KTM dirt bike lineup in that year, and you could opt for the stock standard air-cooled power plant, or you could choose this LC engine bike instead. So there was plenty of choice of models to take your pick from this smaller 125 right up, of course, to the big bore rocket ship KTM 495, which was without doubt one of the biggest and the baddest twin shock open class bikes of its day. So let's just get into some of the parts on this unique Austrian 125, beginning with the bike's chassis, which is basically a light gauge tubular steel frame, which has these double cradle down tubes that run underneath the engine. And as far as I'm aware, this is still very much the same chassis that can also take the 125 air-cooled engine. Now, despite the frame's fragile looks, it was certainly still strong and well suited to this lightweight 125 off-roader. And at first glance, you can also see that this chassis has probably undergone some kind of restoration in the past, because, as you can see, the paintwork of the frame is in immaculate condition for a 43 or 45-year-old bike. But as far as I'm aware, a lot of this bike's parts are still original from that year. Right, onto this quite unique liquid-cooled 125 KTM engine, which, as far as the bottom end of the engine's concerned, this again is much the same bottom end as is used on the air-cooled engine, where the top end is then just simply substituted for an air-cooled barrel and cylinder head. But as with many of the other KTMs or 81s, the engine's crankcases were made of exotic magnesium, which was one of the big weight-saving materials of its time. And although it was strong and much lighter than alloy, it was very expensive to produce. But you can see here on this new liquid-cooled cylinder and barrel, gone, of course, are those big bulky radial cooling fins that were fitted on the earlier air-cooled engine, although this motor here does have a sort of cooling fin effect on the side of the cylinder, but that will have very little to do with assisting the cooling of the temperature of the engine. Now, when these little liquid-cooled 125s hit the tracks in 1981, they weren't without their problems when it came to the actual cooling of that 125 engine. And initially, the radiator was mounted here at the front of the bike, where naturally the onrushing air could assist in keeping the water temperature down, although it wasn't too long before problems with overheating became quite common, because the front grille and consequently the radiator itself began getting blocked with mud and other debris if the track was particularly wet and dirty. So the KTM engineers certainly had to look for another location to house the radiator, so you can guess where they chose as the ideal location. That's right, you guessed it, here underneath the fuel tank, so that the radiator could get the full force of the heat from the KTM's engine. And whether it's any better where it was fitted originally, I don't know, but then again, maybe that's why this bike had such a short production run. And I can't imagine that this radiator would get any cooling benefit at all tucked up here underneath the fuel tank with all that heat that was coming off the engine. But very strange, and at the same time quite unique as well to place it in this position. But you can see the water pump for the cooling system just at the front of that clutch cover, and as I mentioned, all of the casings
were made of magnesium, and I think this bike had a 6-speed transmission inside. Now, to feed the air and fuel mixture into the 125 engine, it was a 38mm Bing carburetor that fed its mixture through a case reed valve induction port, and the plastic airbox also had a foam type filter inside that was removable from underneath the seat for any cleaning or maintenance. But basically this little 125, as I remember, had a bore and stroke of 54 millimeters, and the bottom half of the engine, as I mentioned, was almost identical to the air-cooled version, although this one here had the liquid-cooled barrel and head, and I'm pretty sure that this little engine pumped out around the 28 horsepower mark. But I have to say that this little bike here is in absolutely fantastic condition, and even appears to still have its stock 1981 exhaust expansion chamber, which still looks like it's ding and dent free even after 43 years of use. And with regards to this alloy tailpipe and that expansion chamber, you can see that both appear to be fitted onto the left-hand side of this bike, whereas in that official brochure picture that we had a look at earlier, you could see that they're both on the right-hand side of the bike. So I'm not entirely sure as to how that would be. Maybe it's because this is a European version, and that other bike could be possibly a USA model. But moving on to the front suspension of our LC 125, we have a pair of 38mm Italian Marzocchi forks, which, as I remember, I think gave the rider about 12 inches of travel to play with here at the front. And even for early 1981, these Marzocchis were still decent forks, and they suited this lightweight 125 perfectly, because these 38mm units were also used on some of the much bigger KTM bikes in the range in that year. Now, naturally, because this was still only 1981, you had old school drum brakes and hubs on our 125, and although these weren't your modern day hydraulic affairs that were fitted to some of the later models, these drum and shoe systems still did a very good job of slowing and stopping our 125 KTM, because this bike wasn't exactly a heavyweight at just 91 kilograms, so these drum brakes were more than adequate if you needed the bike brought to a standstill post haste. And here at the back end of the bike, the rear brake once again was quite good at its job, and that attached alloy swing arm was quite substantial for a smaller 125, but it was strong and very well made. And as you can see, it had a chain guide both on the top and at the bottom of the chain run. Now, to operate the rear brake, it was a part steel rod and part cable operated system, and the rear brake backplate anchor was again quite a substantial steel rod that ran from the lower part of the chassis onto the brake backplate. And just in case you're interested, both the front and the rear wheels on this bike were polished alloy sun rims, and as I remember, for 1981 these LC 125s came with Metzler motocross tyres as a standard fitment. But staying at the back of the bike, you can see that KTM certainly didn't scrimp when it came to fitting decent rear suspensions to their 1981 range of bikes, and on our particular LC 125, it's a quality pair of Swedish piggyback Olin units, which for their day were certainly up there with some of the best motorcycle suspensions that were available. And the other plus here is that these shocks were quite easily tunable to the rider's own weight and riding style, and they were also fully rebuildable, which was another plus when it came to maintenance and servicing. So I suspect that between the Italian Marzocchi front forks and these high quality, high performance Olin shocks, the overall suspension system on our 81125 is well and truly sorted. But it was around the early 1980s that most off-road bike manufacturers were beginning to ditch their steel and alloy fuel tanks in favour of these much lighter and cheaper to produce plastic fuel cells. And of course, before steel and alloy tanks, you also had fiberglass that was the chosen material of its day to make these kind of off-road fuel tanks. But these KTM plastic items usually held around the 2-gallon mark of pre-mixed fuel, so that was plenty enough to feed that liquid-cooled two-stroke mill with all of the gas that it required. So as we take a quick look at the seat that's bolted onto our 81 KTM, you can see that it certainly has a look of being quite a comfy place to rest your backside down on, with what looks like a generous amount of padding, and I'm almost certain that this seat here is also used on some of the much bigger KTM bikes like the 250 and 400, or maybe even the mighty 495. And again, the plastic parts on our KTM 125, specifically these rear mudguard and number plate combinations, I'm pretty sure are all reproduction parts, as these are in far too good a condition to be the same stock 1981 components. And up here at the front of the bike, I suspect that that's the case also, as the plastic items here again at the front are almost like brand new. But then again, the overall condition of this little bike is almost immaculate. And as we move up here into the business end of our LC, I suspect that the handlebars and grips, levers, throttle gasser and all of the other associated cables are all brand new items, which is no less than you'd expect to see on a 40 plus year old dirt bike racer. And just hanging down there from the bars, you can see that price tag that was placed on the bike on the day. And as I said, £3,495 or nearest offer was a pretty damn good price for such a rare item. And I expect that it would have cost Solo Motorcycles much more than that just to restore the bike in the first place. So summing up, what we have here is another absolute classic, and as far as I'm concerned, a relatively rare bike when you consider that KTM only built these liquid-cooled 125s for such a short space of time. And for me personally, this is the very first LC KTM 125 that I've ever come across in all my years covering vintage bikes here on my YouTube channel. And I'll certainly wager that very few, if any, of these bikes are still being raced on the tracks today. So this very fine example here is without doubt one of those very unique survivors. And as I've mentioned many times before on my channel, this KTM is quite typical of the very high quality bikes that you can see at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show each year. And if you do have a spare weekend in the middle of February, then it's certainly well worth making the effort to attend the show if these are the kind of bikes that you like to take a look at. So there you have it, a nice 1981 KTM LC125 from Solo Motorcycles. So next up here on CDB TV, we're going to take a close look at this fine 1979 Honda 250 Red Rocket, which again has undergone a full restoration by Scottish racer John Miller. So make sure that you either subscribe or at the least return to my YouTube channel to check out the finer details of this very nice motorcycle. So once again, thanks for taking the time to watch my YouTube channel, and I do hope you found the KTM 125 interesting. But until we speak again, it's goodbye for now.